In 1919, Boston was drowned, not by water, not by fire, but by molasses. A 25-foot wave of syrup ripped through the city, killing people in seconds. Sounds impossible? It really happened. It sounds unbelievable. A city drowned not by fire, not by war, but by molasses. Yet on a cold afternoon in January 1919, the streets of Boston's North End were swallowed by a deadly wave of syrup. It was called the Great Molasses Flood, and it remains one of the strangest and most haunting disasters in American history. That morning began like any other. The sun glinted off the harbor as seagulls cried overhead. Workers shouted along the docks, and the smell of sugar filled the air from the Purity Distilling Company's massive storage tank. Children played stickball in the narrow streets, their laughter echoing between the brick walls. Horses clopped along the cobblestones, pulling wagons of grain and barrels of molasses, and towering above them all stood the tank, a steel giant 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled to the brim with 2.3 million gallons of thick, dark syrup. The tank loomed over the neighborhood like a silent watchman, humming softly as it expanded and contracted with the cold. Locals were used to the sound, used to the leaks too. Molasses often dripped down the sides, and children would sneak over to taste it. To them it was harmless and maybe even sweet, but inside that tank something was going wrong. Cracks had formed. The steel walls, already too thin, strained under the pressure. The temperature had changed rapidly that week. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, and the molasses inside was fermenting, expanding, pushing harder against the metal. Just after noon on January 15, 1919, a deep, thunderous rumble rolled through the streets. People thought it was an explosion, maybe a train derailment. But then came a deafening roar, a metallic scream, and the world turned brown. The tank had burst. Open, a wall of molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles an hour, tore through the North End. It smashed everything in its path. The sound was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. A low, growling wave mixed with the crunch of collapsing timber and the shattering of glass. Buildings crumbled instantly. Wooden homes were flattened, railroad tracks twisted like ribbons. Freight cars were hurled into the air as if they were made of paper. A firehouse was ripped off its foundation and crushed. The air was filled with screams and the sickly sweet smell of syrup. People tried to run, but they couldn't. The molasses was too thick, clinging to their legs, pulling them down. It sucked the air from their lungs, glued their hands together, and muffled their cries. One survivor later said, "It was as if the city was drowning in glue." Children vanished beneath the flood. Horses, terrified and thrashing, were swept away and never seen again. A man on horseback was picked up by the wave, thrown through a fence, and pinned under debris. The force of the syrup was enough to tear doors from their hinges and fling them across streets. The police station nearby was instantly flooded. Officers scrambled onto desks and clung to walls as the syrup filled the rooms. One officer managed to crawl through a window and pull survivors to safety, his uniform soaked and stiff with molasses. At the Engine 31 firehouse, firefighters were trapped when the building collapsed. They could hear each other calling for help, but the syrup made every rescue effort painfully slow. The first responders who arrived found chaos. The molasses was waist-deep in places, thick and heavy like wet cement. Rescuers laid wooden planks on the surface to walk across, using shovels and oars to search for people. Every movement was exhausting. Horses that survived were covered head to hoof in syrup, eyes wide with panic. Firefighters and dock workers hacked through debris with axes, while others used ropes to pull survivors out of the sticky flood. As night fell, the search continued by lantern light. The glow of flames reflected on the molasses, turning the streets into a surreal golden-brown nightmare. By morning, the scale of the disaster became clear. 21 people were dead. Over 150 were injured. Dozens of horses were gone. Buildings and streets were destroyed, and then came the cleanup. Workers used seawater pumped from the harbor to wash the streets, but it barely helped. The syrup clung to everything, wood, brick, and skin. It hardened in the cold, turning into a sticky crust that trapped dust and dirt. Crews worked for weeks, shoveling, scrubbing, and scraping. Boston Harbor turned brown from all the runoff. Even after the streets were clear, the smell lingered. Residents said that for months you could smell molasses every time the wind blew. On hot summer days, the scent returned, thick and cloying, a ghostly reminder of what had happened. Some said they could taste it in the air for years afterward. When the city finally caught its breath, people wanted answers. How could a simple storage tank cause so much destruction? The company that owned it, United States Industrial Alcohol, immediately blamed anarchists, claiming someone had bombed the tank as an act of sabotage. But investigators soon uncovered the truth, and it was much simpler and much more damning. The tank was poorly built. The steel was too thin and brittle for the pressure it held. The rivets were weak. Workers had reported hearing strange groaning sounds for months, and molasses had been leaking long before the explosion. Instead of repairing it, the company had painted it brown to hide the leaks. There had been no safety inspection. No engineer had approved its design. It was a disaster waiting to happen. When the heat of the day caused the molasses to expand, the weakened steel gave way. The explosion wasn't caused by a bomb. It was caused by negligence. The lawsuits that followed were monumental. Families of the victims filed over 100 claims. The legal battle dragged on for more than 5 years, one of the longest in Massachusetts history. Expert witnesses proved that the company had ignored every warning. Eventually, the court ruled in favor of the victims. The company was forced to pay over $600,000 in damages, the equivalent of around $10 million today. But money couldn't undo what had happened. 21 lives were gone. Families were broken. The disaster left a permanent scar on Boston. Yet out of that tragedy came change. The Great Molasses Flood became a turning point in industrial safety. From that point onward, American cities required proper engineering oversight and safety inspections for large structures. Regulations were tightened, and the era of unregulated industrial greed began to crumble. The North End eventually healed. The streets were rebuilt and life returned. Today it's a peaceful neighborhood of cafes, apartments, and small shops. Tourists stroll along Commercial Street, unaware that beneath their feet lies the site of one of the strangest disasters in American history. A small plaque stands quietly near where the tank once stood. It reads simply, "Site of the Great Molasses Flood, January 15th, 1919. No grand memorial, no statues, and just a reminder. Locals still say that on hot summer days, if you walk by the harbor and the wind blows just right, you can smell molasses in the air. It's faint but unmistakable, a whisper of the past. The Great Molasses Flood isn't just a bizarre historical footnote. It's a lesson carved in steel and syrup. It reminds us how negligence can turn even something sweet into a weapon, how ordinary people pay the price when greed outruns responsibility, and how a city can carry the scent of its own history long after the last drop has been washed away. On that January afternoon in 1919, the people of Boston learned that even sweetness can destroy. The wave of molasses came and went in minutes, but its memory has lasted for generations. It stands as one of those rare moments in history when nature and man-made failure collided in the most unexpected way. And perhaps that's why the story still captivates us today. Because it's absurd, tragic, and unforgettable. Proof that history doesn't always roar with guns or flames. Sometimes it comes slow and silent, thick and sweet, until it's too late. So the next time you pour syrup on pancakes or open a jar of molasses, remember the day when an entire city was swallowed by sweetness, when Boston drowned not in fire or floodwater, but in a river of syrup. The day the world learned that even the sweetest things can turn deadly when care is forgotten. And though a century has passed, the legend of the Great Molasses Flood still lingers, a strange, sticky reminder that history, like molasses, never truly washes away. A deep rumble echoed across Boston, then silence. Moments later, a thunderous explosion sent a tsunami of molasses crashing through buildings. You've never heard history told like this? Subscribe now before the next unbelievable story drops.